The Bible links the ancestors of Israel with the ancient civilizations of southern Mesopotamia. These ancestors came originally from the city of Ur. Ur was one of the oldest cities in a region called Sumer. The Sumerians created the first city-states in Mesopotamia more than 5,000 years ago. They invented the cuneiform writing system and created some of the world's earliest literature. They are also credited by some scholars with such inventions as the potter's wheel, the boat, the wheel, the wagon, and the plow.
The ruins of Ur can still be seen today, and the visitor gets a good impression of the dimensions of this large ancient city. Most of its temples still lie buried under the sand. A few have been excavated. One type of Sumerian temple was called a ziggurat. A ziggurat was a four-sided tower in the form of a pyramid. On its outer wall was a wide ramp climbing toward the top of the tower. In the opinion of many scholars, the tower described in Genesis chapter 11, commonly known as the Tower of Babel, is modeled on the ziggurat. At the top of the main ziggurat in Ur was a temple devoted to the worship of the moon god, whom the Sumerians called Nana.
The biblical narrative describes Abram as a nomad or semi-nomad. This means that he moved from place to place with the seasons to find pasture and water for his flocks and herds. However, Scripture also tells us that Abram came from the area of the city of Ur. Some of the residential area of ancient Ur has been excavated.
Together with his father Terah and his nephew Lot, Abram left the great city of Ur to go to Canaan. He became a nomad, moving from place to place. This did not mean, however, that Abram was poor. He was actually a rich man, whose wealth was measured by the number of animals he owned. He moved in a large company of family members and slaves, with a caravan of goods, and with great flocks of goats and sheep, and herds of camels.
The direct line of travel from Mesopotamia to Canaan leads across a desert with few sources of water. Abram and his company followed the normal route, traveling northward along the Euphrates River until they arrived at the plain of Haran in Upper Mesopotamia, an area within the borders of present-day Turkey. This was a journey of almost 1,000 kilometers.
Like Ur, the city of Haran was also a center for the worship of a moon god, known in Haran as Sin. Some scholars have suggested that this might explain why Abram settled in Haran. The temple devoted to the moon god Sin has been excavated.
Abram remained for an unspecified period of time on the plain of Haran. Whether he actually lived inside the city, we don't know. The Bible refers to the ancestors of Israel as wandering Arameans who lived beyond the great river Euphrates and who served other gods. The Arameans, or people of Aram, were a Semitic group from northern Syria. They're frequently mentioned in the Bible, often in a negative sense, as they became the enemies of the nation of ancient Israel. For a long time, their political center was in the city of Damascus.
The biblical sources tell us that the Lord called Abram to leave Haran for the land of Canaan. When Abram moved to Canaan, he stopped first in Shechem and then near Bethel. Later he camped by Hebron, near some oak trees belonging to an Amorite named Mamre. Near these trees, which may have been used by Mamre as some kind of sacred place, Abram built an altar to the Lord. Abram, whose name was changed by God to Abraham, moved around with his flocks in southern Canaan along the edge of the Negev desert as far as Beersheba. Tradition links the well just outside the ancient city of Beersheba with Abraham. The patriarch is supposed to have dug this deep well to water his animals.
It's difficult to determine exactly in what historical period Abraham lived. Scholars now tend to situate the patriarchs in the late Bronze period, roughly between 1550 and 1200 BC. But an earlier date is also possible. For the people of Israel, Abraham was first of all a legendary figure of great traditional significance. He lived in the distant past, in a period that was very different from the time when the biblical author was recording his history. The narratives of Genesis often mention that the Canaanites possessed the land. Abraham's main ally was Mamre, who was an Amorite. The Amorites were also a Semitic people. They were originally nomadic tribes from the eastern deserts who had settled in North Syria. In the late Bronze Age, they mixed with the local populations in Syria and Canaan. In the Bible, the term Amorite is sometimes used in a general sense, meaning the original inhabitants of Canaan, the people of the land. In addition to the Canaanites and the Amorites, there were also Hittites living in the land of Canaan in the time of the patriarchs.
It was from a Hittite that Abram bought a piece of land to bury his wife Sarah. The Hittites are known to us as a powerful people who established a large empire in the ancient Near East between 1600 and 1200 BC. Their homeland and political center was in Anatolia. It is not entirely clear if the Hittites in Canaan maintained ties with the main group of Hittites in Anatolia.
For a small piece of land for family burial, including a cave, Abraham is said to have paid 400 shekels of silver. These shekels were not coins, which only made their appearance in history in Asia Minor in about the 7th century BC. Among the people of Israel, coins did not come into common usage until near the beginning of the 4th century. Before that time, Bible references to money actually indicate raw metal that was measured out by weight. In fact, the Hebrew word for a standard scale weight, shekel, comes from a verb meaning to weigh. The text says that Abraham weighed out 400 shekels of silver to pay for a place to bury his wife.
In ancient Canaan, there was only a small amount of preparation of the body before the burial of an ordinary person. The body was washed, and spices were applied, either as a preservative or against smell. The body was dressed in the dead person's own clothing or wrapped in a cloth. Burial conditions varied according to the station and wealth of the family. Nomadic groups, such as the patriarchs, simply buried the body under a pile of stones or near some landmark along the route of travel.
People living in permanent dwellings also had more permanent places of burial. Poorer people did little more than scrape out a shallow hole in which to place the body, covering the hole with stones. Richer people had tombs in caves or cut out of the rock in a location near the area of settlement, but outside of it. These were family tombs, which were reused for several generations.
After a body had been placed in a cut tomb or a cave, it could be an attraction to wild animals in the area. In order to prevent the animals from getting to the body, the entrance to the tomb was blocked up with stones. If it was a tomb owned by rich people, then it could be a specially prepared stone. Sometimes it was a kind of round boulder that was rolled down an incline to block the entrance. At other times, it could be a stone in the shape of a cylinder that was rolled in front of the opening from the side. Burial in the ancient world was often done in stages. After the person died, he was brought in and laid on a kind of shelf. We can even see here in this very rich tomb a place for the head. The body was left for about a year, and at the end of that year, when the flesh had decayed off of the bones were collected and they were moved down into a special collection area so that the shelf then would be free for the next person who died.
Between the first and second burials, the family was considered to be in mourning. The practice of burying a person in the same tomb with members of earlier generations gave rise to the expression, "He lay down," or "he slept," with his fathers.
Some personal possessions were buried with the corpse. These were just symbols of who the person was in life, although some may have been intended to comfort the person in the afterlife or to drive away evil spirits. Sometimes oil lamps were placed at the head of the corpse, along with items of food and drink.
Many rituals accompanied the period of mourning. These could include tearing cloth, wearing a heavy cloth with a coarse weave, known as sackcloth, and throwing dust or dirt on one's head. Mourners wore black clothing, removed all ornaments, and went barefoot. A period of mourning and special widow's clothing are mentioned in Genesis 38 in the story of Judah and Tamar. There were also many physical movements connected with mourning. Some of these were weeping and fasting, beating the breast, lifting hands in the air, lying or sitting in silence on the ground, covering the lips, and bowing the head. Sometimes the grieving family hired professional women mourners. The scriptures call these mourning women, or skillful women, or even singing women. The professional mourners could also be accompanied by the playing of flutes.
Abraham came to a land where the amounts of annual rainfall vary greatly from one part of the land to another. The western slopes of the central ridge receive more rain than the slopes to the east of the ridge. Fixed agriculture is difficult on the east slope, which is better suited for the grazing of animals. However, the large combined flocks of Abraham and his nephew Lot could not find sufficient grazing areas and watering places. They had to split up.
At the south end of the Dead Sea stood several cities in a broad plain. The book of Genesis describes this plain as being green and fertile. The most prominent of the cities were Sodom and Gomorrah, and there were two others, Admah and Zeboim. Lot, the nephew of Abram, chose to live in the city of Sodom. Genesis chapter 19 describes a great destruction of this plain in a judgment of God. And Deuteronomy reflects the result with these words, "The fields will be a barren waste, covered with sulfur and salt. Nothing will be planted, and not even weeds will grow there."
When the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by fire, Lot escaped with his two daughters. The three lived in a cave above the plain of the destroyed cities. Lot's two daughters were either engaged or possibly married. Their husbands had refused to leave Sodom. Out of sexual relations with their father, the daughters of Lot gave birth to two sons, Moab and Ammon, the Moabites and the Ammonites, who later inhabited the Transjordan area, would become enemies of Israel.
It was the custom among Semitic peoples to marry within the wider family related to the father. Marriages were often arranged by the heads of families and agreed by a contract. The terms of the contract would include the payment of a bride price by the family of the groom. There was a period of betrothal lasting a year. Only divorce or death could cancel the betrothal, and if the man died during this period, the woman was considered to be a widow. Abraham sent his servant all the way back to Mesopotamia to find a wife for his son Isaac. There the servant found Rebekah, the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor. Abraham had to pay a bride price to Nahor's family. When Rebekah accepted the offer to become Isaac's wife, she received from Abraham a special wedding gift consisting of jewelry made of silver and gold and dresses. This was an exceptional display of generosity by Abraham. Twin sons were born to Isaac and Rebekah. Esau was born first and so became the first heir of Isaac's wealth. The second son, Jacob, tricked his blind father by pretending to be Esau, and so he obtained the ancestral blessing that traditionally belonged to the firstborn son. Jacob was afraid that his brother would try to get back at him, so he ran away to Haran, where his grandfather Abraham had lived. There he worked as a shepherd for his uncle Laban and married Laban's 2 daughters. However, the relationship between Jacob and his father-in-law got worse and worse. After serving Laban for about 20 years, Jacob one day gathered together his wives, his children, his slaves and animals, and left the plains of Haran. He didn't tell Laban of his intentions, but more or less just fled from Haran back to Canaan, where his father Isaac still lived.
Rachel had stolen a number of small statues from her father's house before leaving for Canaan. We do not know what exactly these statues or figurines represented. Perhaps gods, or possibly ancestors. They were quite small and were in common use in homes all over Syria and Canaan, and even among the Israelites themselves. Such statues, called teraphim in Hebrew, were very important to the people of that time, who believed they protected the family and increased the fertility of the fields and the women. When Laban discovered that Jacob had fled from Haran and that the teraphim had been stolen, he quickly decided to chase the group of Jacob. He caught up with them in the hill country of Gilead. Jacob did not know that Rachel had taken the teraphim. He denied the theft and challenged Laban to search all the tents. Rachel had hidden them in her tent, under the saddle of a camel. Claiming to be unwell, she remained seated on the saddle when her father entered her tent to search for his gods.
The quarrels between Laban and Jacob helped to explain the deep-rooted hostility that existed between the Israelites and the Arameans in later times. The narratives of the book of Genesis provide the background for the historical and political relationships between Israel, its rivals, and its neighbors, as those relationships would exist later between 1000 and 400 BC. The narratives all have repeated themes. There is rivalry between brothers and other family members. Deceit and trickery play dominant roles. Scholars call these narratives etiological, which means that they explain how a present situation originated.
Upon returning to Canaan, Jacob informed his brother Esau of his arrival. According to this narrative, Esau took 400 men and approached the group of Jacob from the south. Esau lived in the land of Seir, in what is now southern Jordan.
The 2 brothers met near a wadi, or dry riverbed, named Jabbok, which we can see out behind me in the distance here. There, the night before, Jacob had had his name changed to Israel after a struggle through the night with a mysterious divine being. The 2 brothers separated afterwards, and each went his own way.
Esau returned to his home in Seir, and Jacob went on into Canaan, where he settled near the city of Shechem in the central hill country. From these 2 brothers would come 2 rival nations, Edom and Israel.
Selah was the capital of the Edomite kingdom. The Edomites were the descendants of Edom, the son of Esau. The Edomites frequently appear in Scripture as the enemies of Israel. King David conquered the Edomite kingdom, but just after over 100 years, they managed to free themselves from the rule of the kings of Judah. In the 4th century BC, they lost most of their territory to the Nabateans. Jacob had 12 sons, and these became the forefathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. A number of narratives in the book of Genesis tell about rivalries between the 12 brothers. The story of Joseph, who was sold by his brothers into slavery, is the most expanded example of this rivalry theme in Scripture. The brothers were jealous because Joseph was the favorite son of Jacob.
Probably because of successive years of poor rainfall, Canaan suffered from famine conditions. This was a periodic danger in a land situated on the edge of the desert. It was in similar circumstances that Abraham had left for Egypt shortly after arriving in Canaan.
The sons of Jacob also now went to Egypt with their families and animals to escape starvation in the land of Canaan. Joseph, the brother they had sold into slavery, had risen to become the vizier or prime minister of the king of Egypt. Some scholars date these events to the time when the land of Egypt was under the rule of foreign kings, whom the Egyptians called Hyksos. They were a non-Egyptian group whose origins are obscure. They probably spoke a Semitic language. The Hyksos had conquered Egypt around 1700 BC and stayed in power for more than a century. It's quite possible that Joseph served in the court of one of the last Hyksos rulers.
The Hyksos had built their capital in the northeastern part of the Nile Delta. The name of the capital was Avaris. If it is accurate to date the Joseph story to this time, then it would have been here that Joseph lived and worked. However, there is still much uncertainty as to the dates of the patriarchs and Joseph. The ruins of the Hyksos capital are barely visible today at a place called Tel Ed-Daba.
Around 1550 BC, the Hyksos were driven out of Egypt and a new dynasty of native Egyptians took the reins of power. The descendants of Jacob living in Egypt, sometimes called Hebrews, grew in number and became more and more a risk factor in the eyes of the new rulers. The first chapter of Exodus describes the rise to power of a king who did not know Joseph. This probably reflects the fact that a new dynasty had taken over, a dynasty that had not worked with Joseph as prime minister. The king, known by his Egyptian title of Pharaoh, decided to impose heavy labor on the Hebrews. In order to limit their numerical growth, he ordered that all newborn male babies should be killed.
Egypt's new rulers established their capital at Memphis, on the banks of the Nile River a few kilometers south of present-day Cairo. It appears that Moses grew up there, at the royal court. The pharaoh of the first two chapters of Exodus was probably Raamses II, who was able to re-establish Egypt's control over the land of Canaan and southern Syria. Raamses II built a new capital in the eastern delta, the city of Ramses, named after himself.
In a later dynasty, with its capital city at Memphis, Moses' family is found living near the Nile River. It seems possible that Moses made long journeys between the capital city and the region where most of his people were living.
The Hebrews were forced to labor in the construction of the new capital and another city called Pitom. They had to produce mud bricks. The bricks were used for all buildings except palaces and temples. These more important buildings were constructed of stone that had to be transported by boat from far up the Nile.
The people of Israel were put to work building cities for the Egyptian king. They probably did not build the temples and large administration buildings which were made of stone. Instead,